Hi everyone, welcome back to the Casual Watch Review channel. So on this week's episode, I am lucky enough to interview Josh, who works as an independent repair specialist focusing on vintage watches. Now this interview is actually in response to a upload I did a few weeks ago now, where I asked for your viewers' help and your interesting stories. And I'm really thankful to have Josh on. So Josh, a big thanks for joining us today.
No, thank you. Pleasure's mine. Thanks for having me.
I think a great first question will be, how did you get started in servicing vintage watches? Were you a watch collector to start with, or?
I wasn't a watch collector to start. I really got into the hobby. I was looking for the latest Samsung Gear smartwatch, and I happened to be on Amazon poking around and saw some pictures of some mechanical watches, probably Seikos, some entry level type mechanical watches. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And so I started looking around and seeing what was out there, and then made my way over to YouTube and quickly found the YouTube watch community, right? All the usual suspects, your channel, Sam. And I mean, it felt like probably day one I was hooked. Just these tiny little machines on your wrist that told time, that looked cool, a lot of history, just everything that kind of goes into watches. It really, within a couple of days, I was hooked. I was hooked. And then as I, started researching more and kind of getting into the mechanical watches and what it meant to own and collect mechanical watches, you quickly find out that you have to service these things, right? They're mechanical, moving, living things that need service. And I'm such a cheapskate. I didn't want to pay somebody to service a watch that I owned, And so I thought, well, how hard could it be to learn how to service my own watch? I was watching Watch and Listen with Cameron Weiss, the American watchmaker out in LA. And his advice to budding watchmakers was to buy pocket watch movements because they were bigger, and practice on pocket watch movements. So I hopped on eBay, found a lot of pocket watch movements, brought them in, started working on them, and of course destroyed a couple. Then I got comfortable enough with what was going on. I decided to move into wristwatches, and so I was buying lots of broken vintage watch movements to just practice on. Watched a lot of YouTube videos, read a couple books, and just got into it and just started doing it. And if my original goal was to learn how to service a watch to the point where I could take care of my own collection, through the process of learning, I discovered I like working on watches more than I like owning watches. And it became a passion. And here I am, 12, 18 months later, and I've bought and sold probably hundreds of vintage watches, just because it's so much fun for me to do.
Quite a leap for most watch collectors, isn't it? From collecting watches to actually opening it up and starting tinkering around with your own watches. So that's quite cool that you took that leap. I'd never heard that about working on pocket watches first.
Yeah, the idea is they're bigger, and they are bigger. They're a lot bigger. 2.5 times the size. So the idea is that as you're learning how the components interact with each other, what they are, what they do, there's more. It's easier to see. It's physically easier to work on them because they're bigger. And then as you get more comfortable with what's going on, you kind of can work in the smaller watches. For Christmas, I actually took the plunge and worked on a ladies movement, a Lady Hamilton movement, which is it's smaller than a dime. It's the same movement, same everything that's going on. It's just smaller, and there's no way I could have done that without the experience of working on larger movements.
When you first got started, did you make an investment in any specialist tools, or did you just kind of use what you already had?
Yeah, great question. So when I first got started, I have a nasty habit of picking up hobbies and putting them down, shortly thereafter. So I really didn't want to invest in a $400 set of screwdrivers or an $80 set of tweezers or anything like that. So I bought pretty mediocre tools, to be honest. They were good enough to get the job done, and they were good enough, obviously, to get me hooked. But then when I discovered that this is something that I want to spend every spare moment that I have doing, I then invested in more and better tools. So I would, my suggestion to folks who ask the question is, you really do want to spend money on a good set of screwdrivers, a good set of tweezers, and then adequate kind of everything else, and figure out if this is something that you like, that you're good at, that you're going to, dedicate some time to. And then you can kind of slowly grow your toolkit. And you don't need to run out and buy every last little tool, every special little tool that's out there. Just grow your tools as you progress in the hobby and as you need them. I don't have a staking set because I'm not comfortable with, pressing jewels, for example, right? So, I haven't gone out and spent $1,500 on a staking set just because it's beyond my skill set at this point. When I get to that point, then yeah, I'll go out and spend the money and do that. But, and buy tools that are good enough to get the job done. Buy the best tools you can afford.
I've often talked about that period in history that was phenomenal for US watchmaking. And then in the 70s, it almost completely died. And a lot of those brands didn't survive, or they exist as some kind of like Chinese shell company now. But you arrived on Hamilton, which I think it's phenomenal that Swatch carried on Hamilton brand. I still think to this day that they make the best value for money watches. But how did you arrive on vintage Hamilton instead of, I know a lot of people gravitate towards Seiko.
No, great question. So the short answer is I have no idea. So when I first started off, when I was buying lots of watches, it was most of the American brands, the Walthams, Elgins, like that. And there was just something about the design of the design and aesthetic of Hamilton watches that really, it spoke to me. There was just something special about the case design, the dials, and then really it became, speaking of communities, there's a big community of specific to vintage Hamilton watches. So the resources out there, you can go online, you can find the Hamilton watch catalog from 1933 and look at the pictures and see what they were charging from back then. You can go on and download the repair manual from 1947 and see how a 747 Hamilton movement was put together. You can get the part numbers, at a certain point they change the part numbers, and there's conversion sheets out there. So a lot like Seiko, there's a big community around it that has documented these historic resources and posted online. So repairing it becomes easy, and couple that with the fact that I really like the way they look. The movements are high quality movements, especially the American made movements. Not every broken watch that I've gotten have I successfully repaired, right? But because I kind of focus on Hamilton, it's not a broken watch anymore. Now it's a donor watch, right? It's spare parts. And so it becomes a little bit more efficient for me as well to kind of focus on one brand.
So now Hamilton use modified ETA movements. Was that the case with the vintage models? Did they use movements from other suppliers, or were they a movement manufacturer themselves?
Yes, is the answer. They did both. Mid-50s, they started using ETA, A-Shield, and Burin for their Swiss movements. They were still manufacturing movements in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, American made, but they started to introduce some of the Swiss movements in the mid-50s. And then in 1969, the American manufacturing shut down and everything was moved over to Switzerland. So it is really interesting, to kind of watch, especially in those like I said, those mid-50s era watches, some you can get, and it's an American-made movement, it's a Hamilton movement. And then anything with a date or an automatic watch, that was going to be a Swiss-made watch. So it's kind of neat watching how they progress and the different design decisions that are made of the watch itself, but also, of the movement and the parts that go into it.
Is there a Hamilton that when you see it, you just straight away just avoid it completely because they're impossible to service? Or do you like the challenge of the more sort of difficult to manage or sort of niche movements?
Yeah, that's a great question. The thin line, it's a Burin movement, and it's a micro rotor. And so the rotor is on the same level as the rest of the movement. There's it's like 4 or 5 wheels between the rotor and the ratchet wheel to wind the thing. Super small, super fiddly. There's one bridge that you have to line up to get all of those 4 wheels. I mean, fiddly is just the word, right? there's no two ways around it. I think I've only done that once, and I probably got 3 or 4 more on my bench that I've been avoiding. Just because I'll look at the thin line and say, okay, that's 6 hours of work or whatever it is, and then I'll look at a 1940 Ross or something that has a 982 movement in it, and I know that I could be done with that in 3 hours. And so I kind of look at my clock, and it's like, all right, I can spend 3 hours on this watch. I really don't want to dedicate the next day to a thin line.
So in this community of Hamilton watch restorers, is there one watch that's like the holy grail?
The Ventura is very popular, right? Elvis's watch. There is a specialized niche community, and already niche community with the Hamilton military watches. Very, very popular. Those usually go for a premium. Those can go for 3 or 4 times what a normal watch would go. I think Hamilton has so many models and has such a long history, especially from 1892 when they were started, and just with pocket watches all the way through 1969 when they went over to Switzerland. There's something for everybody in Hamilton.
I've always fancied a Hamilton military watch, but whenever you look on eBay, I don't know how anybody can make like an informed decision, because it seems to be saturated with all sorts of different watches. And it was my understanding, certainly the Vietnam watches, were they weren't stamped on the dial, but a lot of people are aftermarket stamping Hamilton on the dial.
I personally stay away from it because of just what you said. I don't know enough about those specific reference numbers, those specific movements, those specific years to quickly look at an eBay listing and understand this is what I'm getting myself into. Depending on how you look at it, there's nothing inherently wrong with a redial. I think it comes down to disclosure. Collectors appreciate transparency, and I think collectors are savvy enough that as a seller, just disclose what's going on. Hey, I think this is a redial. I didn't redial it. It looks like a redial to me, though. Here it is, right? And let the collectors decide. And so, with the military watches, I think that the incentive for less than scrupulous sellers to mislead collectors is high enough to where now you're starting to see. Let's call it what it is. You're starting to see fraud, right? And that's a game that I just don't want to play. Those are waters I just don't want to wade into.
So a good question is, what is a day in the life for you? Do you do this full time, or is it still very much a part-time pursuit for you?
Oh, it's definitely part-time. It's absolutely a hobby. I would say maybe, a pro-am kind of thing, right? A semi-pro sort of deal. I do have a day job. So a typical day, typical week would probably be, go to work, do the typical 9 to 5 thing, come home, dinner with the family, put the kids to bed, read a story, chat with my wife, take care of some things. And then I may be down in the office, down in the basement for, maybe at 8 o'clock at night. And, depending on what I got going on the next day, I'll spend 2 or 3 hours, down here either, just disassembling a watch or finishing up the cleaning of the watch or assembling a watch. Yeah. I've kind of learned to break it up, right? And when I first got into it, and that's how I knew I was hooked. When I first got into it, I would be down here from 8 o'clock at night till 3 in.the.morning because I was just so excited to see this thing through and like see if I could accomplish it and see if I could get it running. And now I'm confident enough to know that, okay, I can get this going. I don't need to, be late to work the next day just to try to get this watch going. So it's probably 2-3 hours a day, and probably 5 days a week, and I don't sacrifice family time for that. I enjoy this hobby a lot, but I love my family a lot more.
Final question is, you obviously spent a lot of time servicing these watches. And you can't keep them all. I understand you actually sell some of them. So how do people find out more information about the watches that you've restored?
Yeah, that's right. So I typically sell the watches on Etsy. So you can find me on Etsy. I'm Wolfe Watches, Wolfe WOLFE Watches on Etsy, and then I also have an Instagram account. That's Wolfe Vintage Watches. Again, Wolfe with an E. On Instagram, so you can follow me there as well.
If you've got any questions about this video, leave a comment in the comments section down below. You can contact me on any of these social media links or at thecasualwatchreview.com. Josh, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Guys, as always, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time on the Casual Watch Review channel. Thanks, guys. Bye.